The winter sun cast long shadows across the gleaming rows of cars at Premier Motors, one of the city's most prestigious dealerships. Among the usual weekend crowd of young professionals and wealthy families, an elderly man in a well-worn brown sweater and comfortable walking shoes made his way slowly between the vehicles, his weathered hands gently touching the hoods as he passed. At 72, Mr. Chen had spent his entire life working hard and saving carefully. After running a successful chain of neighborhood convenience stores for 4 decades, he had recently sold his business to a larger company, leaving him with considerable savings that he'd never had the chance to enjoy. Today, he had decided to fulfill a lifelong dream, buying a luxury car he'd always wanted but never allowed himself to purchase. The dealership's floor was busy that Saturday morning, with salespeople darting between customers like bees in a flower garden. Yet, despite Mr. Chen's obvious interest in the vehicles, not a single salesperson approached him. He could hear their whispered conversations and subtle chuckles as they passed by, clearly judging him by his modest appearance. "Look at that old-timer," one salesperson muttered to another. "Probably just trying to get warm. Bet he can't even afford the floor mats." Their laughter stung, but Mr. Chen maintained his dignity, continuing his careful inspection of each vehicle. After 20 minutes of being ignored, Mr. Chen approached the reception desk, where a young woman was busy typing on her computer. "Excuse me," he said politely, "I'm interested in looking at the new S-Class sedan." The receptionist barely glanced up from her screen. "Sir, those vehicles start at $120,000. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at our used car location across town?" Her tone carried that special kind of condescension reserved for those deemed unworthy of respect. Mr. Chen stood straighter, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of amusement and determination. "I understand the price," he replied calmly. "I'd still like to speak with a salesperson." After several more minutes of waiting, a junior salesperson finally approached him, clearly having drawn the short straw among his colleagues. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone Mr. Chen had been hearing all morning. "Yes, I'd like to test drive the S-Class, please," Mr. Chen requested, pointing to a sleek silver model nearby. The salesperson couldn't suppress his smirk. "Sir, we require proof of financing before test drives of our luxury vehicles. Perhaps you'd like to start with something more accessible?" Mr. Chen reached into his worn leather wallet and pulled out his platinum credit card and bank statement. The salesperson's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly recovered his composure. "I'll need to verify this with my manager," he said, walking away with the documents. As Mr. Chen waited patiently, he could hear the conversation at the manager's desk. "He probably just withdrew his life savings for this," the manager laughed. "We'll waste an hour with him just to have his application denied." What the dealership staff didn't know was that Mr. Chen had been carefully researching luxury cars for months. He knew every specification, every option package, and current market prices. He'd even called other dealerships in neighboring cities, but had decided to visit this one first because it was closest to his home. The manager finally approached, wearing a forced smile. "Sir, while your documents seem to be in order, we're quite busy today. Perhaps you could come back another time?" It wasn't even a question, it was a dismissal. Mr. Chen nodded slowly, taking in the scene around him. He watched as other customers received enthusiastic greetings and attentive service. He observed the quick judgments, the whispered comments, and the casual cruelty of assumptions based on appearance. Instead of leaving, he took a seat in one of the plush waiting area chairs and pulled out his phone. The dealership staff exchanged confused glances as the elderly man began making calls, speaking quietly but firmly into his device. "Yes, I'd like to speak with Mr. Thompson, please," he said into the phone. "Tell him it's regarding Premier Motors." "Yes, I'll hold." The dealership staff continued their regular activities, occasionally glancing at the persistent elderly man who refused to leave. None of them realized that Mr. Chen wasn't just making any ordinary call, he was reaching out to his investment banker, the same one who had helped him invest his business proceeds wisely over the years. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Mr. Chen remained in his seat, making more calls and taking careful notes in a small notebook he carried. He noticed how the staff's behavior changed throughout the day, how they treated different customers, how they handled negotiations, and most importantly, how they seemed to judge worth based solely on appearance. The dealership was about to close when Mr. Chen finally stood up. He approached the manager's office one last time, still carrying the same calm demeanor he'd maintained all day. The manager looked up, irritation clear on his face. "Sir, we're closing," the manager said firmly. "You'll need to leave." Mr. Chen smiled, the kind of smile that carried years of wisdom and patience. "Of course," he replied. "I just wanted to let you know that I've spent the day making some interesting observations and important phone calls. You'll be hearing from Mr. Thompson tomorrow morning. He's quite interested in discussing the future of this dealership." With that cryptic message, Mr. Chen turned and walked out of the dealership, leaving behind a group of confused and slightly unsettled employees. None of them could have guessed that while they were busy judging him by his humble appearance, Mr. Chen had been quietly setting in motion events that would drastically change their futures. As he drove home in his reliable old Honda, Mr. Chen reflected on the day's events. He wasn't angry, disappointment, yes, but not anger. In his decades of running businesses, he had learned that sometimes the most valuable lessons come disguised as challenges, and tomorrow would certainly be a day of valuable lessons for everyone at Premier Motors. The next morning arrived with an unusual buzz at Premier Motors. The sales team was gathering for their regular morning meeting when an expensive black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Out stepped Mr. Thompson, one of the city's most prominent investment bankers, accompanied by two other executives in crisp suits. The dealership manager's face turned pale as he recognized Mr. Thompson, a regular client who purchased a new vehicle every 2 years. But today, Mr. Thompson wasn't here to buy a car. "Good morning," Mr. Thompson announced, his voice carrying across the showroom. "I believe we need to have a serious discussion about yesterday's events." The manager quickly ushered the group into his office, his hands visibly shaking as he closed the door. Meanwhile, the same junior salesperson who had dismissed Mr. Chen the previous day was straightening the brochures on his desk when he noticed another familiar face entering the dealership. It was Mr. Chen, but today he wasn't wearing his comfortable sweater. Instead, he was dressed in a well-tailored business suit, though he carried himself with the same humble demeanor as before. The whispers among the staff started immediately, but this time they carried a different tone, one of uncertainty and growing unease. Mr. Chen walked directly to the manager's office and knocked on the door. When it opened, Mr. Thompson greeted him with a warm handshake and a broad smile. "Everyone, I believe you remember Mr. Chen from yesterday," Mr. Thompson said, addressing the now gathering staff. "What you don't know is that Mr. Chen is one of our bank's most valued clients. He recently sold his business for a considerable sum and was looking to make a new investment." The manager's face grew even paler as Mr. Thompson continued. "Mr. Chen called me yesterday to discuss potentially purchasing this dealership. After reviewing the business's performance and yesterday's events, we've reached an agreement with the current owner group." A pin drop could have been heard in the showroom. The same salespeople who had snickered and whispered about the old-timer now stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and embarrassment. Mr. Chen stepped forward, his voice calm and measured. "I didn't come here yesterday planning to buy a dealership," he explained. "I simply wanted to purchase a car, something I've dreamed about for years after working hard and saving carefully. But what I witnessed yesterday showed me that this business needs something more valuable than new ownership. It needs a lesson in humanity." The junior salesperson who had dismissed Mr. Chen felt his chest tighten with shame as the elderly man continued speaking. "In my 40 years of running convenience stores, I learned that success isn't built on quick judgments or flashy appearances. It's built on treating every person who walks through your door with respect and dignity. Mr. Thompson handed the manager a folder containing official documents. The ownership transfer will be completed by the end of the week, he stated matter-of-factly. Mr. Chen will be taking over as the new owner, and he has some changes in mind. The staff exchanged nervous glances, surely wondering about their jobs. Mr. Chen seemed to read their thoughts and smiled gently. "I don't believe in punishment for past mistakes," he assured them. "I believe in learning and growing. Everyone in this room will have the opportunity to keep their position, but we're going to do things differently." He walked over to the silver S-Class he had admired the day before, running his hand along its smooth surface. "Starting today, we're implementing new training programs focused on customer service and respect. We'll learn to see beyond appearances and treat everyone who walks through those doors with the same level of service, whether they're wearing designer suits or worn sweaters." The manager, still processing the morning's events, stepped forward. "Mr. Chen, I don't know what to say except that we're deeply sorry for how we treated you yesterday." Mr. Chen nodded acknowledgement but remained focused on his message. "In my stores, we had a saying, every customer carries a story we don't know. Some of our most loyal customers over the years were people others might have overlooked. They remembered how we treated them when they had little, and they stayed with us as they prospered." He turned to address the entire staff again. "I'm not here to shame anyone or to take revenge. I'm here because I see potential for this dealership to become something special. A place where everyone feels welcomed and respected, regardless of how they look or what they wear." The morning sun now streamed through the showroom windows, casting a warm glow over the assembled group. Mr. Chen reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his worn leather wallet, the same one that had carried the platinum credit card that had been questioned the day before. "Inside this old wallet," he said, holding it up, "are pictures of my family, my first store's opening day, and memories of every step that led me here. It may look worn, but it carries my life's story. Just like this wallet, every person who walks through those doors carries their own story. Our job is not to judge those stories, but to become a positive part of them." The staff stood in respectful silence, the weight of his words settling over the showroom. The same receptionist who had suggested Mr. Chen visit the used car lot the day before found herself wiping away tears. "Now," Mr. Chen said, his eyes twinkling with that same mixture of wisdom and determination, "shall we begin our first day under new management? I believe I still need to test drive that S-Class." A gentle wave of nervous laughter rippled through the group, breaking the tension. As the staff dispersed to their positions, there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere. The smugness and superficial judgments of yesterday had been replaced by something else, something that felt more like humility and hope. The following weeks at Premier Motors brought changes that no one had expected. Mr. Chen arrived early each morning, greeting every employee by name, from the maintenance staff who polished the showroom floors to the top salespeople. He carried a small notebook, just like the one he'd used on that fateful Saturday, jotting down ideas and observations throughout the day. One morning, he gathered the entire staff before opening. "Today," he announced, "we're going to do something different." He pulled out a stack of worn photographs from his old wallet. "These are pictures of my first convenience store. When I started, I had nothing but a dream and a commitment to treat every customer like family." The staff leaned in, curiosity replacing their initial uncertainty. The photos showed a much younger Mr. Chen standing proudly in front of a tiny store with faded signs. "My first customer," he continued, "was a homeless man who could only afford a cup of coffee. I served him with the same respect I would give to a millionaire. He later became our most loyal customer, and when he finally got back on his feet, he brought his whole office to shop at our store." The junior salesperson who had dismissed Mr. Chen on that first day raised his hand hesitantly. "But sir, how do we balance that with meeting our sales targets? We work on commission, and we need to focus on customers who can actually buy." Mr. Chen smiled warmly. "An excellent question. Let me show you something." He walked over to a whiteboard and began writing numbers. In my convenience stores, we found that treating everyone with respect led to a 40% increase in repeat customers. Word of mouth became our best advertisement. The same principle applies here. He turned to address the group. From today, we're changing the commission structure. Instead of basing it solely on sales, we'll include customer satisfaction scores, repeat business, and referrals. Every interaction matters, whether it leads to an immediate sale or not. The changes began immediately. The showroom was rearranged to create comfortable seating areas where customers could relax and discuss their options without pressure. The coffee station, once reserved for serious buyers, was made available to everyone who walked in. Mr. Chen even installed a small play area for children, remembering how his own grandchildren would get restless during long purchases. But the most significant change came in the form of a unique training program. Mr. Chen invited people from all walks of life, students, elderly couples, working-class families, and successful entrepreneurs, to visit the dealership and share their car-buying experiences. The staff listened to stories of discrimination, pressure tactics, and dismissive treatment they had faced at various dealerships. One afternoon, an elderly woman in a shabby coat entered the showroom. Before Mr. Chen's changes, she might have been ignored or politely directed to the used car lot. Instead, the same junior salesperson who had once dismissed Mr. Chen approached her with a genuine smile. "Welcome to Premier Motors," he said warmly. "How can I help you today?" The woman explained that she was looking for a car for her grandson's college graduation. As she spoke, she pulled out a wrinkled envelope full of carefully saved cash, her entire life savings. The salesperson listened patiently, then spent the next hour helping her understand different financing options that could help her keep most of her savings while still getting her grandson a reliable car. Mr. Chen watched this interaction from his office, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. Later that day, he called the salesperson in. "You've learned well," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. Inside was a performance report showing that the salesperson's customer satisfaction scores had risen dramatically over the past few weeks. "I never realized," the salesperson admitted, "how many opportunities one was missing by judging people too quickly. Yesterday, a man in work clothes bought 2 luxury cars after I treated him with respect, one for himself and one for his wife. He owned a construction company but liked to dress casually." Mr. Chen nodded knowingly. Success isn't always wrapped in designer clothes. Sometimes it comes in work boots and carries calloused hands. He paused, then added, "Just like wisdom doesn't always come in expensive suits." The dealership's reputation began to change throughout the city. Stories spread about the luxury car dealership where everyone was treated like a VIP, regardless of their appearance or background. Customers began driving from other cities just to experience the difference. One day, a young couple walked in, clearly nervous about being in a luxury dealership. They were greeted warmly and offered coffee. As they looked at cars, they overheard another customer talking about how he had bought his first car here 20 years ago when he could barely afford it, and now he was buying his 5th car from the dealership. The staff noticed that under the new commission structure, their incomes actually increased. Repeat customers and referrals poured in. The pressure to make quick sales disappeared, replaced by a focus on building long-term relationships with clients. Mr. Chen implemented a unique customer feedback system. Every buyer received a follow-up call not just from the sales team, but from Mr. Chen himself. He wanted to hear their experiences firsthand, just as he had done in his convenience stores. During a staff meeting, he shared a letter from a recent customer. "I've bought cars from various dealerships," the letter read, "but never have I felt more valued and respected than at Premier Motors. The salesperson spent time understanding my needs, never pressured me, and helped me find the perfect car within my budget. This is how car buying should be." The manager, who had almost lost his job during the ownership change, approached Mr. Chen after the meeting. I need to confess something, he said. When you first took over, I thought all these changes would ruin the business. I was wrong. We're not just selling more cars, we're making a difference in people's lives. Mr. Chen placed a hand on the manager's shoulder. In my 40 years of business, I learned that profit is important, but purpose is essential. When you combine both, that's when true success happens. As the sun set on another busy day at Premier Motors, Mr. Chen stood in the showroom, watching his staff interact with customers. The atmosphere had transformed from one of judgment and pressure to one of warmth and genuine service. The gleaming cars still stood in perfect rows, but now they weren't just status symbols, they were vehicles for changing perspectives and building relationships. 3 months after Mr. Chen took over Premier Motors, the dealership had become something of a local legend. What caught people's attention wasn't just the sales numbers, which had surprisingly doubled, but the stories that kept spreading throughout the community. One rainy Tuesday morning, a young woman in nursing scrubs rushed into the showroom, seeking shelter from the downpour. She apologized immediately, worried about dripping water on the polished floor, but was met with a warm smile from the receptionist, the same one who had once dismissed Mr. Chen. "Please, come in. Would you like some coffee to warm up?" The nurse, exhausted after a 12-hour night shift, gratefully accepted. As she sipped her coffee, she found herself looking at the cars, particularly a modest sedan in the corner. The receptionist noticed her interest and, instead of making assumptions, asked about her story. "I've been saving for 3 years," the nurse explained. "I work night shifts at the children's hospital, and my old car keeps breaking down. I never thought I'd walk into a place like this, but I heard from my patients' parents that you treat people differently here." Mr. Chen, who had been arranging some displays nearby, overheard the conversation. He approached quietly, still maintaining his habit of listening before speaking. The nurse continued sharing her story, explaining how she needed a reliable car for her late-night shifts but was worried about the financing. "You know," Mr. Chen finally said, joining the conversation, "my wife was a nurse for 40 years. She taught me that those who care for others often forget to care for themselves." He gestured to one of his salespeople. "Let's see what we can do to help you get safely to and from those night shifts." By the end of that morning, the nurse had not only found a car within her budget but also learned about a special financing program Mr. Chen had created for healthcare workers and first responders. What she didn't know was that this program had been inspired by the many nurses who had frequented his convenience stores during their late-night shifts over the years. The dealership's transformation began attracting attention from unexpected places. Local business schools started sending students to observe their customer service model. Mr. Chen welcomed them, sharing his philosophy that success in business comes from seeing the humanity in every transaction. One day, a group of competing dealership owners visited, curious about how Premier Motors had managed to increase its market share so dramatically. They found Mr. Chen in his usual spot, on the showroom floor, talking with customers and staff. "Your sales figures are impressive," one owner commented, "but aren't you worried about wasting time on people who can't afford your cars?" Mr. Chen smiled, reaching for his ever-present notebook. "Let me share some numbers with you," he said, flipping through the pages. "In the past 3 months, 30% of our sales have come from customers who were turned away by other dealerships. Another 45% came from referrals, people who heard about how we treated their friends or family members." He led them to his office, where a wall displayed photographs of happy customers with their new cars. "See this gentleman?" He pointed to a picture of a man in paint-stained work clothes standing next to a luxury SUV. "He owns the largest painting company in 3 counties. He bought 5 vehicles from us for his family after we treated him with respect when he walked in covered in paint after work." The visiting owners listened skeptically as Mr. Chen continued. "But the real success isn't in the numbers. It's in the relationships we're building. Last week, a customer brought us homemade dumplings because we helped his daughter buy her first car. You can't measure that kind of goodwill on a spreadsheet. As if to prove his point, the door opened, and an elderly couple walked in with a large basket of fresh bread. They had bought a car 2 weeks ago, and the husband had mentioned that he was a retired baker. Now they were back, not to buy another car, but to share their gratitude. The transformation wasn't just affecting sales, it was changing lives. The staff noticed that their own perspectives had shifted. The junior salesperson, who had once judged customers by their appearance, now kept a journal of the stories he heard each day. He shared one particularly meaningful experience during a staff meeting. "Yesterday, a man came in wearing clothes that had seen better days," he recounted. "Instead of making assumptions, I asked about his story. Turns out he was a retired teacher who had spent his life savings helping his students afford college. He didn't buy a car, but he told his nephew about how we treated him. That nephew came in today, he's a successful software developer, and bought our top-of-the-line model." Mr. Chen's influence extended beyond the dealership's walls. He started a mentoring program, inviting local business students to learn about customer service and ethical business practices. The dealership began hosting monthly community events, turning the showroom into a gathering space where people from all walks of life could connect. One such event was particularly memorable. The nurse who had come in during the rainstorm returned, but this time with several of her colleagues. They were organizing a charity drive for the Children's Hospital, and Mr. Chen immediately offered the dealership as a collection point. The showroom soon filled with donated toys and supplies, becoming a symbol of community support. The local media picked up on these stories, but what caught their attention wasn't just the business success, it was the ripple effect throughout the community. Other businesses began adopting similar practices, realizing that treating people with dignity wasn't just good ethics, it was good business. Mr. Chen observed all of this with quiet satisfaction. During a quiet moment one evening, as he was preparing to leave for the day, he found himself looking at the spot where he had stood 3 months ago, being ignored and dismissed. The memory didn't bring bitterness, instead, it reminded him of how a moment of disrespect had transformed into an opportunity to create lasting change. As he walked to his car, the S-Class he had finally bought, though he still preferred to drive his old Honda most days, he passed the wall of customer photos. Each picture told a story of someone who had walked through those doors carrying their own dreams, fears, and hopes. The dealership had become more than a place to buy cars, it had become a testament to the power of seeing the humanity in every person who walked through its doors. 6 months into Mr. Chen's ownership of Premier Motors, something unexpected began to happen. The dealership's influence had started creating waves across the entire business community. It began with a simple visit from the owner of a struggling high-end restaurant located just 2 blocks away from the dealership. The restaurant owner had noticed how his customers kept mentioning Premier Motors during their dinner conversations. Intrigued by the constant praise, he decided to visit the dealership himself, not to buy a car, but to understand what made it so special. He found Mr. Chen in his usual spot, not in his office, but on the showroom floor, helping a young couple understand their financing options. The restaurant owner watched as Mr. Chen patiently explained complex terms in simple language, never rushing, never pushing, just helping. After the couple left, beaming with excitement about their new car, the restaurant owner introduced himself. "I've been in the restaurant business for 15 years, he explained, but lately, I've been losing customers to newer places. I heard about what you've done here, and I had to see it for myself." Mr. Chen invited him to share a cup of tea in the customer lounge. "Tell me about your restaurant," he said, pulling out his familiar notebook. As the restaurant owner shared his struggles, Mr. Chen listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "You know," Mr. Chen said finally, "when I ran my convenience stores, I noticed something interesting. The most successful store wasn't the one in the wealthy neighborhood, it was the one where the staff knew every customer's name and story. Why don't you spend a day here and observe how we operate?" The restaurant owner accepted the offer, and what he saw transformed his approach to business. He watched as the dealership staff treated every person who walked through the door with genuine interest and respect. He observed how they remembered small details about customers' lives and followed up on previous conversations. Inspired, he returned to his restaurant and began implementing changes. He trained his staff to focus on creating relationships, not just serving meals. Within months, his restaurant had regained its former glory, with a new reputation for making every guest feel like family. Word spread through the local business community. Soon, other business owners began visiting Premier Motors, not to buy cars, but to learn. Mr. Chen found himself hosting informal mentoring sessions every Friday morning, sharing tea and wisdom with local entrepreneurs. During one such session, a young tech startup founder asked, "But how do you maintain this level of personal attention as you grow? We're expanding rapidly, and I'm worried we'll lose our human touch." Mr. Chen smiled and led the group to the dealership's new training room. The walls were covered with photographs, not just of cars and happy customers, but of small moments, staff members helping elderly customers with their groceries, salespeople playing with children while parents discussed purchases, mechanics explaining repairs using simple diagrams. Every morning, Mr. Chen explained, "We gather here and share stories. Not sales figures, but stories." Yesterday, one of our salespeople spent 2 hours helping a customer find a different dealership because we didn't have the specific model they needed. This morning, that customer's brother came in and bought 2 cars from us. The impact extended beyond business practices. The dealership had become a kind of community hub. The comfortable waiting area often hosted informal business meetings. The children's play area had become a favorite spot for local parents to meet while getting their cars serviced. Even the coffee station had turned into a place where people from different walks of life connected and shared stories. One day, a local business magazine reporter visited to write a story about the dealership's success. She arrived early, before the dealership opened, expecting to find a quiet building. Instead, she found the staff engaged in their morning meeting, with Mr. Chen leading a discussion about a letter they'd received. The letter was from a customer who hadn't bought a car. "I came in feeling nervous and embarrassed," the letter read, "because I knew I couldn't afford any of your vehicles. But your staff treated me with such respect, helped me understand my financial options, and even suggested other dealerships that might better fit my budget. That experience gave me the confidence to start my own business. 2 years from now, I'll be back to buy my dream car." The reporter watched as Mr. Chen used this letter to teach an important lesson. Success isn't always immediate, he told his staff. Sometimes it's planting seeds that will grow in their own time. The dealership's approach had created an unexpected ripple effect in the community. Local schools began asking Mr. Chen to speak to students about business ethics. The Chamber of Commerce created a monthly roundtable where businesses could share stories about putting people before profits. Even the local university's business school added a case study about Premier Motors to their curriculum. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the community viewed success. Other businesses began to realize that profit and compassion could coexist. A local bank, inspired by Premier Motors, revised its loan application process to be more understanding of different circumstances. A high-end clothing store trained its staff to treat all customers with equal respect, regardless of their appearance. One afternoon, as Mr. Chen was reviewing the month's performance reports, his assistant brought in a stack of letters. They weren't just from customers, they were from business owners across the city, sharing stories of how changing their approach had transformed their businesses. A beauty salon owner wrote about how she'd started offering free haircuts to job seekers, inspired by Premier Motors' community-first approach. A grocery store manager shared how remembering customers' names and stories had turned his store into a neighborhood favorite. A real estate agent described how treating every house hunter with respect, regardless of their budget, had led to her most successful year ever. Mr. Chen carefully filed these letters in his growing collection of community stories. To him, they were more valuable than any sales report. They proved that his vision of business, one built on respect, dignity, and human connection, wasn't just idealistic thinking. It was a practical, sustainable model that could transform entire communities. As the sun set on another busy day, Mr. Chen stood in his favorite spot in the showroom, watching the interaction between staff and customers. He saw how a simple greeting could turn into a meaningful conversation, how a moment of kindness could build a lasting relationship, and how treating everyone with dignity could transform not just a business, but an entire community's way of thinking. 8 months after Mr. Chen's takeover of Premier Motors, the dealership story had begun attracting attention far beyond the local community. It started with a viral social media post from a traveling businessman who had experienced the dealership's unique approach firsthand. The businessman had walked in wearing casual clothes after a long flight, expecting the usual dismissive treatment he'd received at other luxury dealerships. Instead, he found himself wrapped in the warmth of Premier Motors' hospitality. The post he shared that evening reached millions. "I walked into a luxury car dealership in sweatpants and was treated like a CEO. What happened next changed my view of how business should be done." His detailed account of the experience, complete with photos of the community wall and the comfortable waiting area filled with people from all walks of life, sparked a nationwide conversation about customer service and human dignity in business. One quiet Tuesday morning, Mr. Chen arrived at the dealership to find a surprise visitor, a representative from the automobile manufacturer's corporate headquarters. The representative had flown in unannounced to investigate how this small dealership had achieved the highest customer satisfaction scores in the nation while simultaneously breaking sales records. "I've been in the auto industry for 20 years, the representative said, "and I've never seen numbers like these. What's your secret?" Mr. Chen simply smiled and said, "Let me show you." He led the representative not to his office filled with charts and graphs, but to the showroom floor where the day was just beginning. They watched as a construction worker in dusty boots was offered a fresh cup of coffee and treated with the same respect as the business executive in an expensive suit looking at the latest luxury model. The representative observed how the staff remembered customers' names, asked about their families, and showed genuine interest in their lives. "You see," Mr. Chen explained, "we're not just selling cars. We're building relationships that last generations." Yesterday, a grandmother brought her grandson to buy his first car because we treated her with respect when she came in just to use our restroom 3 months ago. The corporate representative spent the entire day observing, taking notes, and talking to customers. He witnessed something he'd never seen before in a luxury dealership: genuine joy, both from the customers and the staff. That evening, during the staff's daily reflection meeting, a new salesperson raised his hand. "I used to work at another dealership," he shared, "where we were taught to qualify customers within the first 30 seconds. Here, I've learned that every 30 seconds is a chance to change someone's life." The corporate representative, still observing, watched as Mr. Chen asked each staff member to share a story from their day. The maintenance worker talked about helping an elderly customer change a flat tire in the parking lot. The receptionist shared how she'd helped a lost delivery driver find his way, only to have him return later to look at cars because of her kindness. Just then, an unexpected visitor walked in, the homeless man from Mr. Chen's first convenience store, now a successful business owner himself. He had driven from 3 cities away after hearing about Mr. Chen's new venture. The 2 old friends embraced, and Mr. Chen introduced him to the staff. "This man," Mr. Chen said, his eyes twinkling with memory, "taught me the most important lesson in business 40 years ago. When you treat someone with dignity, you're not just serving a customer, you're investing in humanity." The corporate representative was moved by what he witnessed. Before leaving, he made an unprecedented decision. Premier Motors would become the pilot location for a new corporate initiative focused on community-centered business practices. The manufacturer would send dealers from across the country to learn from Mr. Chen's approach. But success brought its own challenges. As more people heard about the dealership, the volume of customers increased dramatically. Mr. Chen faced a crucial question: how to maintain the personal touch while serving more people. His solution was characteristically thoughtful. Instead of expanding the showroom or hiring more staff, he implemented what he called the story system. Every employee, from the janitor to the sales manager, was encouraged to document meaningful interactions in a shared digital journal. These stories were shared during morning meetings, helping the entire team maintain their connection to the dealership's mission. One entry read, "Today, a woman came in who had been saving for 3 years to buy her daughter a car for college. When she apologized for taking up too much time with questions, I shared how Mr. Chen had once been treated poorly for asking questions. She cried and hugged me. Her daughter will pick up her new car next week." The dealership's influence continued to grow in unexpected ways. Local schools began bringing students for field trips, not to look at cars, but to learn about business ethics and human dignity. Mr. Chen would sit with the students, sharing his convenience store stories and teaching them that success comes from how you treat people, not just what you sell. A group of business students from the state university conducted a study of the dealership's impact. They found that Premier Motors had not only transformed the local business community but had created what they called a ripple effect of respect, where people who experienced the dealership's approach began treating others differently in their own lives. One day, a young entrepreneur visited the dealership. She had read about Premier Motors and wanted to understand how to implement similar practices in her tech startup. Mr. Chen spent an hour with her, sharing his philosophy. "The biggest mistake in business," he told her, "is thinking that efficiency and humanity are opposites. The most efficient way to run a business is to treat people so well that they become your marketing department." As if to prove his point, at that very moment, a customer walked in with his entire extended family. He had bought a car 3 months ago and had brought his relatives from out of state to experience the dealership for themselves. The showroom filled with laughter as the staff welcomed them like old friends. The day ended with Mr. Chen gathering his team for their evening reflection. The corporate representative's visit had brought national attention, but Mr. Chen reminded his staff of what truly mattered. "Tomorrow," he said, "newspapers might write about our success. But the real story isn't in the headlines. It's in the single parent who feels respected while buying their first car. It's in the elderly couple who brings us homemade cookies because we treated them like family. It's in every person who walks through those doors carrying their own hopes and dreams." 10 months into Mr. Chen's ownership of Premier Motors, the automotive industry had begun to take serious notice. What started as a local success story had evolved into a movement that was challenging long-held assumptions about how car dealerships should operate. The transformation began with a national automotive conference where Mr. Chen was invited as the keynote speaker. Instead of preparing a traditional presentation filled with charts and statistics, he brought something different: his old convenience store apron and the worn leather wallet that had started it all. Standing before hundreds of industry executives and dealership owners, Mr. Chen began not with sales figures, but with a story. 10 months ago, I walked into a dealership wearing a shabby sweater, carrying 40 years of business experience in a worn wallet, and was judged unworthy of respect. Today, I'm here to tell you why that moment might have been the best thing that ever happened to the automotive retail industry. The audience listened intently as Mr. Chen shared how Premier Motors had transformed from a traditional dealership into a community cornerstone. He invited his staff members to share their experiences, including the junior salesperson who had once dismissed him. The young salesperson, now the dealership's top performer, spoke with emotion. "I used to think success in sales meant finding the right customers. Now I know it means treating every person right. Last week, a customer drove 6 hours just to buy a car from us because his cousin told him how we helped her when her car broke down, even though she hadn't bought it from us." During the conference, something unexpected happened. Dealership owners began sharing their own stories of lost opportunities and regrets about customers they had misjudged. One owner spoke about losing a major sale because his staff had dismissed a farmer in overalls who turned out to be one of the region's largest agricultural suppliers. Mr. Chen's approach was spreading, but not without skepticism. During the Q&A session, a prominent dealer challenged him, "This might work in your market, but what about highly competitive areas? We can't spend time on people who aren't serious buyers." Mr. Chen pulled out his notebook and shared some surprising statistics. In the past 10 months, 60% of our sales came from referrals. We spent $0 on traditional advertising because our customers became our marketing team. The average customer now drives past 3 other dealerships to reach us. Tell me, how much do you spend trying to attract customers who drive past your dealership? The numbers were compelling, but it was the human stories that truly captured attention. Mr. Chen invited a customer to speak, the nurse who had sought shelter from the rain months ago. She shared how the dealership's respectful treatment had not only helped her buy a car but had inspired her to start a program helping other healthcare workers with their transportation needs. Following the conference, automotive manufacturers began sending their executives to spend time at Premier Motors. They weren't just studying the sales process, they were learning how to build genuine connections with customers. One manufacturer was so impressed that they launched a pilot program called the Chen Method at selected dealerships across the country. The program wasn't about scripts or sales techniques, it was about changing the fundamental way dealerships interacted with people. Back at Premier Motors, Mr. Chen remained focused on the daily moments that mattered. One morning, he noticed a young man repeatedly walking past the dealership, looking in but never entering. On the third day, Mr. Chen went outside and invited him in for coffee. The young man, it turned out, was a recent immigrant who drove for a ride-sharing service. He had been dreaming of owning his own car but was afraid of being rejected. By the end of their conversation, Mr. Chen had not only helped him understand his financing options but had connected him with a local business owner who needed drivers for his delivery service. 3 months later, that same young man returned, this time as a successful small business owner looking to buy 3 cars for his growing delivery company. He brought with him other immigrant entrepreneurs who had similar dreams but had been afraid to enter a luxury dealership. The dealership's training program had evolved into what the industry now called dignity-driven sales. Other dealerships sent their staff for month-long immersion experiences, living the Premier Motors way. They learned that success wasn't about quick sales tactics but about building lasting relationships. One day, a television crew arrived to film a documentary about the dealership's impact on the industry. They expected to capture dramatic success stories but instead found themselves moved by the small moments, like when the entire staff gathered to celebrate a customer's cancer remission, or when a salesperson spent their lunch break teaching an elderly customer how to use their car's new technology. The crew's producer was particularly struck by a scene they captured unplanned. A wealthy executive had arrived to pick up his new luxury car at the same time a retired teacher was there to look at used vehicles. The staff treated both customers with identical respect and attention. The executive was so impressed that he later returned with his company's entire fleet account. Mr. Chen's philosophy had begun to reshape industry standards. Trade publications that once focused solely on sales techniques now featured articles about community engagement and building long-term customer relationships. Sales training programs across the country started incorporating lessons about human dignity and genuine connection. But perhaps the most significant change was happening in the lives of individual people. The dealership had become a place where dreams were not just sold but nurtured. A wall in the customer lounge displayed photographs and letters from people whose lives had been touched by their experience at Premier Motors. One letter read, "I came here feeling broken after losing my job. The way your staff treated me, with respect, without judgment, gave me the confidence to start over. Today, I'm running my own successful business, and it all started because someone treated me like I mattered." During a staff meeting, Mr. Chen shared a profound observation. "We're not in the car business," he said, "we're in the people business. Every person who walks through those doors carries a story, a dream, and the potential to change not just their own life but the lives of others. Our job is to recognize and honor that potential. As the industry continued to evolve, Premier Motors remained a beacon of what was possible when business was conducted with heart. The dealership had become more than a case study in success. It was proof that treating people with dignity wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the smart thing to do. 1 year had passed since that fateful day when Mr. Chen walked into Premier Motors wearing his old sweater. The dealership was preparing for a special anniversary celebration, but not in the way most businesses would. Instead of focusing on sales achievements or profit margins, Mr. Chen had something different in mind. He invited everyone who had been part of the dealership's journey, from the first customers to the staff members who had initially dismissed him. The showroom was transformed into a gathering space where people from all walks of life shared their stories of how a simple philosophy of respect had changed their lives. The morning of the celebration began with Mr. Chen arriving early, just as he did every day. He stood in the exact spot where he had waited to be acknowledged a year ago. But this time, instead of being ignored, he was surrounded by a team that had become more like family. The junior salesperson who had reluctantly served him that first day now stepped forward to address the gathering crowd. His voice trembled with emotion as he spoke. "A year ago, I thought I knew everything about selling cars. I judged people by their clothes, their walk, their appearance. Mr. Chen didn't just teach us a better way to sell cars, he taught us a better way to live." Throughout the day, people shared their stories. A young entrepreneur spoke about how the confidence she gained from being treated with respect at Premier Motors helped her launch her now successful business. A retired teacher described how the dealership had become a place where he brought his students to learn about dignity in business. The local bank president stood up to share something unexpected. "We've completely transformed our lending practices because of what we learned from Premier Motors," he announced. "We now look at the person's character and story, not just their credit score. Our default rates have actually decreased, while our community impact has soared." As the stories continued, Mr. Chen quietly slipped away to his office and returned with his old convenience store apron and the worn leather wallet. He held them up for everyone to see. "These reminded me every day of where I came from," he said, his voice gentle but clear. "But more importantly, they reminded me of a truth I learned 40 years ago, that every person carries their own version of a worn wallet, filled with dreams, struggles, and hopes. Our job isn't to judge the wallet's appearance, but to honor the story it contains." He then revealed something he had never shared before. In his wallet, he had kept a list of every person who had dismissed him that first day at the dealership. Not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of the power of presumption and the importance of seeing beyond appearances. "Today," he continued, "many of those same people have become our most dedicated advocates for change in the industry. They learned, as I did many years ago, that success isn't measured by the cars we sell, but by the lives we touch." The celebration took an unexpected turn when a group of business school professors announced they had been studying Premier Motors' impact. Their research revealed something remarkable: the dealership's approach had created a ripple effect of dignity that extended far beyond car sales. Businesses that had adopted Mr. Chen's philosophy reported not just higher profits, but significantly improved employee satisfaction and customer loyalty. The professors had documented cases of people changing their own behavior in other aspects of life after experiencing the Premier Motors approach. As the day progressed, Mr. Chen gathered everyone for a special announcement. "Premier Motors was never about me," he said. "It was about proving that dignity and success can go hand in hand. Today, I'm establishing the Dignity in Business Foundation, funded by a portion of our profits, to help other businesses learn and implement these principles. The foundation would provide resources, training, and support to businesses committed to putting human dignity at the center of their operations. But more than that, it would serve as a reminder that success and compassion are not opposing forces, they're complementary strengths." Near the end of the celebration, a surprise visitor arrived, the manufacturer's CEO. He had flown in specifically to make an announcement. "What started in this dealership has transformed our entire company," he declared. We're implementing the dignity-first approach across all our dealerships worldwide. Mr. Chen has shown us that the future of business lies in treating every person with respect. As the day drew to a close, Mr. Chen gathered his staff for one final moment. He pulled out his familiar notebook, now filled with a year's worth of stories and lessons. "When I walked in here a year ago," he said, "I thought I was just buying a car. Instead, we all became part of a movement that's changing how business is done." He turned to the last page of his notebook and read a quote he had written years ago in his first convenience store: "Success is not about the transaction you make today, but about the relationship you build for tomorrow." The celebration ended with Mr. Chen doing what he did best, listening to one more customer's story, offering one more cup of coffee, sharing one more moment of genuine connection. The dealership had become more than a business, it was a testament to the power of treating every person with dignity. As the last guests left, Mr. Chen stood in the showroom, looking at the wall of photos and letters that told the story of their journey. Among them was a new addition, a simple frame containing his old sweater, the one he'd worn that first day. Below it was a plaque that read, "Every person who walks through these doors carries a story worth hearing." The lights dimmed on Premier Motors' first year under Mr. Chen's ownership, but its influence continued to shine bright. The dealership had proven that success in business doesn't come from what you sell, but from how you make people feel. It had shown that profit and purpose can coexist, that dignity and success can walk hand in hand. And somewhere in the city, someone who had been touched by their experience at Premier Motors was sharing their story, spreading the ripple effect of respect and dignity even further. The revolution that began with an elderly man in a worn sweater had become a movement that would continue to transform lives, one interaction at a time.